Welcome to this first in 3 webinars with David from WP Engine. I'm not going to try and say your name. It's Vogelpohl.
Vogelpohl.
Can you say it for me?
Sure, it's Vogelpohl.
Vogelpohl.
Yep.
Vogelpohl, great stuff. And this one is going to be about speed, and that speed is not just about being fast, it's about making more money. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Performance has a direct impact on the ability of your site to convert. So what I'm hoping to cover here today are some tips people can walk away with to make their site faster, but also to grow their revenue.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. I'm really looking forward to this. I know Jono knows a lot about speed as well. Bill, from what I understand, now we'll start with you introducing Bill. Bill Erickson, you're a super WordPress expert, but you were a photographer and a graphic designer.
Yeah.
And so you've changed a lot, and you did philosophy, moral philosophy.
Yeah, I studied 1 semester at Oxford, moral philosophy. That was a long time ago. Yeah, I've been a WordPress developer for 14 or 15 years now. I was originally a finance major, graduated during the economic recession, and was like, well, this WordPress thing's working, and it's worked out well for me. And I work mostly with publishers and food bloggers and like high traffic sites that require a lot of speed and performance at scale.
Well, that's brilliant. But the most interesting thing I found about you is you had a series of conferences called Bill, which is brilliant. You really thought about that.
Yeah,
and it was a competitor to TED, yeah?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, in college, me and my friends, that was when TED first launched their online videos, and we loved watching them, and we wanted to go and just hang out in the town and hopefully run into people and have good conversations. And we figured if we're going to be there, why don't we hold our own unconference? And so TED was the high dollar, hard to get tickets closed conference, and we had our own open unconference, and we actually had a bunch of TED speakers come speak at Bill, so we had a lot of fun.
So it was TED speaking at Bill. Brilliant stuff. I love that. Now on to Jono, who I know quite well. I think your image is frozen, Jono. At least it has for me. But we can still hear you.
I'm definitely here.
Well, we can hear you talk. Right, yeah. Well, I know you live in York, but you work at Yoast in Holland, and you go there. Is it once a week?
Oops.
Oh, we've lost him. So we'll have a.
Oh,
there you go. We're back again.
There we go. Excellent. Sorry. Yes. Yeah, I'm over there once a month, which is great. Get to go visit the Dutch family.
And you said Yoast was the perfect job for you. It's the dream job. It's a dream job even.
Oh yeah, I'm a technical SEO nerd, and I do a lot of research, and I'm fascinated by how we fix the web at scale. So this is great. It's just an opportunity to play and to experiment.
Yeah, and didn't they say to you when you first turned up in the office, sit down in that corner and do whatever you want? It's a bit like play school, yeah?
I don't think it was quite that explicit, but that seems to be what happens. I just turn up and do stuff, and nobody's fired me yet, so I'll keep doing that.
Yeah, and you decided to work on Schema. I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated what you guys have done with Schema. I mean, we're all having these incredible problems figuring out how to write Schema, and you've kind of defined how we're now going to write Schema. I mean, I tell my clients, when you're writing your own schema, look at what Yoast is doing. Install a copy of Yoast on a WordPress site and just copy what Jono's doing, because that's how it's going to be done. How's that feel?
That's amazing. I mean, that was a big part of the motivation. So, like, it's almost accidental that the outcome of what we've done is fixed schema for Yoast and WordPress. What I really wanted to do is say, how do we define a standard and a process and a mental model that everybody can pick up and run with? Because schema's hard. It's hard to do it right. It's hard to do it at scale. It's hard to maintain. So that was the bit we really wanted to solve, and I think we've done a decent job of it so far. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I like the idea of the kind of the model that we should be following, the template, the framework. I think phenomenally important and brilliantly done. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about speed. And all I remember about what you said to me last time about speed was something about a warehouse with conveyor belts and boxes. You can explain that later on, yeah?
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I look forward to that.
And David, we have never met, but we're about to start doing a 3-part series, so we're stuck with each other, whether we like it or not.
We'll find out after this webinar.
Yeah. And then maybe we won't do the second one, or we'll be sulking for the second one instead of being friends.
I'll do my best.
So I know very little about you. I do know, however, that you made enormous strides forward for a site with 9 languages, and I know how hard that is.
Wow.
Yes, absolutely. I've been in my digital career since 1996 and supported countless numbers of businesses. I ran an agency for 5 years as well, focused on WordPress. But yes, one of those in particular, we converted into 9 languages, and the technology and of course the localizations and translations themselves. And that's definitely not an easy thing to do.
No, I was incredibly impressed just reading that. And now you're working at WP Engine, which is a phenomenal company. I mean, I've sent a few people your way and they've all been incredibly happy.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I joined the WP Engine senior leadership team back in 2015. Prior to that, in my agency days, WP Engine was also one of my clients. So I'd actually been in service of the company since basically it was founded.
Brilliant stuff. So who wants to get started? Speed to make you money. That's how I interpret it. But Davey's going to put that a little bit more eloquently, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. I have a deck that I'll walk through with some of the particular points. And then, of course, the panelists here will help me kind of unpack some of these things. So if you're ready, Jason, we can go ahead and kick off with the slides. Yeah,
I'm keen, enthusiastic, and very much ready. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, really kind of focus this presentation on not settling for slow. I think we make a lot of compromises sometimes in the sites we build, and it really does have a material impact. I already mentioned, been in digital for over 20 years now. And for those that may happen across me here and there, these are some of the things I work on. WP Engine leadership. I'm the lead of the Genesis and StudioPress business unit in the WP Engine business, and then contribute to the community in different ways. You can see some of those here. But what I want to talk today about, though, is performance specifically. I think a lot of folks oftentimes think of performance as a vanity metric. Hey, the boss is complaining because the site is slow. But the reality is, of course, is that it's actually a growth metric. There are tons of studies out there that cover the impact of performance on conversion rates. But this one, I think, from Cloudflare was very easy to understand. The longer it takes a website to load in this particular study, you can see the conversion rate gets worse and worse over time. So as you think about optimizing your site for speed, what you're really doing is optimizing your site for revenue. I'm curious, Bill, I know you work on a lot of sites. Have you seen like material revenue changes from increasing the performance on a site?
Yeah, we for one particular site, we got a year-over-year increase in revenue of 300%. It was a publisher with advertising, and traffic went up and revenue went up. And yeah, speed definitely is a huge factor.
Yeah, I think that's such a great example, and it's one of the few ways you can actually increase revenue from the traffic you already have, in addition to things like A/B testing. But obviously, performance is a big deal when it comes to growth. Another interesting implication of speed is that performance does affect SEO, especially on mobile. Now, having a fast website is not going to make up for having terrible content or having like your HTML not be semantic and things like that. So don't view it as like a magic bullet, but certainly all things being equal, you can be on unequal footing in terms of SERPs if you have a low performing website. Jono, I'm curious, I know you're an SEO nerd. What is your view on the impact of speed as it relates to SEO?
So I think, Jason, we've talked about this. I think it's really interesting. It's unclear how and where Google actually monitor the speed of a page. And there are so many different metrics, which I'm sure we'll come on to, and so many different versions of what fast looks like. I think one of the things we do know that they are obsessive about is trying to understand good user experience. Does this page provide a good user experience? And a slow page cannot provide a good user experience, at least in comparison to a faster page. I think so. They're definitely monitoring either directly or indirectly, and it doesn't matter. If you make a faster page, it's a better experience. What I think is really interesting is the incremental increases we're talking about, like going from 1.2 seconds to 1.1 second, aren't always particularly noticeable to users, but they definitely have an impact. They correlate with conversion, they correlate with money. And that's because they're either reducing friction or distraction. And that moment where I might have said, I'm annoyed at this, I'm going to check another tab, I'm going to look at Facebook, I'm going to look at my phone, or the moment where I think this is annoying, I'm now less likely to convert. All of those things sum up together and give you a better user experience. So even if it's not directly impacting SEO or directly impacting conversion, it's such a key part of how people perceive those interactions that it's just a no-brainer to be optimizing the heck out of it.
Exactly. So obviously there's a little bit of a black box there, a big black box when it comes to
Yep.
But they have publicly stated, of course, that it does play a role. And of course, they've also been very aggressive in terms of pushing this notion of that performance matters. So I think when it comes to SERPs, it is something to keep in mind. But obviously, separate and apart from that, if it helps you grow your revenue, maybe 300% like Bill noticed, then who cares how it affects your SERPs? So let's talk a little bit about defining your benchmarks for performance. I think this is important to think about your measurement tools. There's all kinds of different options. One of my go-to tools is webpagetest.org, which I know is super popular. Webpagetest.org tests the front end of your website, so it's not doing things directly like testing back-end processes. The metrics or KPI that I like to optimize for are your speed index score or start render. However, personally, what I like to do most of the time, I think we lost the slides there for some reason. Oh, there we are, back again, is to use what's called the film strip view in web page test. And this, as you can see at the top of this slide, shows you visually how your site looks at specific points in time. And so as you start thinking about like, well, when does my page load? When is it enjoyable for the user? It might be difficult to discern that relative to the numerical KPI or all these little items on the bottom that they call the waterfall graph. And so the film strip view is a nice visual way to get a feel for how your site looks at any moment in time. In the film strip view, you can kind of pull it back and forth. And if you look closely, there's a red line in the waterfall graph below. And everything to the left of that line was stuff that got in the way of your page loading up until that point in time when the visitor is delighted. And so as you think about optimizing your site when you use webpagetest.org, figure out where that moment in time is where you're delighting those visitors, and then everything to the left of the red line is what you want to start optimizing first. I did do a podcast on this a while back with the founder of Webpage Test, Patrick Meenan. And if you go to that little URL there on the left, you can hear all about his thoughts on how to use that tool. Bill and Jonah, do you all ever use Webpage Test, or do you have like a favorite tool of choice?
Yeah, I use Webpage Test, and I also like using the Audits tab in Chrome's Inspector, which I think goes through Google's, what is it, Insights or whatever.
Awesome.
Yeah, me too. I really like this. I also like the Network tab in Google Chrome's console, which is a bit developer-y, but if you hit, I think, F12 on a Windows machine, you get a whole bunch of developer-y stuff up. If you hit Network and load the page, you get something that looks just like this, but it's from your browser, so you can see and you can refresh it and you can test it. Sometimes quite nice for experimenting and trying to see where those bottlenecks are. But yeah, definitely to your point, the idea of trying to cherry pick and find out where are those things that are holding up that final moment is definitely the best approach to speed optimization. It's not to say I should start with my images or I should start with my server. It's definitely to look at something like this and go, which bits are holding up the page finishing?
Exactly. And it's interesting, you commented earlier a little bit on all the different ways Google could measure for performance. And you mentioned how you like the Network tab, which of course runs from your browser. Webpage Test is what's called a lab test, meaning that it's running from a server in a data center somewhere. And you also have the option to emulate different connections like 3G, and you can also do different locations. And this actually becomes very important, and I have an example here in a minute of how you can tease out some of this information. But where people are located is also extremely relevant when it comes to how your site is performing. Web Page Test emulates these experiences and allows you to choose different geographies. And so there's some of those capabilities there. But again, everyone has their own favorite tool. I just happen to choose this one for the majority of my testing, and you may choose other paths, of course, that are relevant for yours. But the important thing is to set that metric, measure it, and then remove those barriers from delivering that point of delight for those users. Bill, you mentioned earlier, Google has this cool tool called Page Speed Insights. A lot of people confuse this tool as a pure page speed tester, but it actually goes much deeper than that, providing heuristics or advice on what areas of your site might be causing a low score. But the reason I like this tool is it's actually super helpful for unpacking what might be wrong or what might be getting in the way with your site delivering a delightful experience. But you also get a little peek at how Google views page speed and what they consider to be a delightful experience. Again, I don't think anyone on this call has any direct information to say they're using the score in the SERPs. But obviously you can gain a lot of confidence that from their view, your site is performant by achieving a good score on this tool. Jono, do you have any thoughts on this one? I know this is a very SEO specific topic in some ways.
Yeah, it's a follow the money question, right? You look at how much Google talk about speed and the fact that the best in-class tools are developed and rolled out by Google. The best documentation in the space is by Google. So this is the Page Speed Insights tool. The Page Speed Insight documentation and the pages and pages behind it are literally writing the book on how to build a fast website. It's not a coincidence that they're investing this much time, attention, and money in providing the tool set and the instructions on how to do this. They really care. And yeah, of all the tools out there, this is the one that's definitely closest to what they perceive good to be like.
Awesome. So yeah, again, black box.
Somebody's just asked, somebody just asked, is this actually so very useful for websites, or is it really aimed at PWAs?
Page Speed Insights, I believe, has heuristics around PWAs, but it is aimed at websites.
Thank you.
I'm unsure specifically of their PWA capabilities, but definitely aimed at any website. Okay, so earlier we talked about all the different ways you can measure performance. One of the more interesting ways for me is something called RUM, or Real User Metrics. I actually don't know if Google Analytics uses RUM in this particular report, but at the bottom of this slide, there's a little URL that will take you to a custom Google Analytics template. And what RUM essentially does is it measures the speed from the user's browser. So we talked about how your geography, your location is important. But what's also important is what network you're connected to. Who is your ISP? And if you're a webmaster, who are the ISPs and geographical locations where my users are located? So the further the distance can introduce things like hops and latency, which can slow your site down for a particular user. But then, of course, there's also the exchange between the internet and the ISP's network that your end user will use. And so what this custom report in Google Analytics does is it allows you to isolate by country, by city, and by ISP the performance of users on your website. So if you're focused and you have a local business that's focused in, say, New York City, you don't really care what a lab server might say your speed is in California. What you really want to know is is it Charter Communications in New York City, because that's the ISP that services most of my area. Bill or Jono, have you ever gone to this level of measuring performance where you're looking at city, country, and ISP?
After you,
I
Bill.
haven't. I haven't used that specific report. We use Google Analytics a lot to get information on where their users are coming from, what sort of devices they're using, and what the capabilities of their browsers are. But I haven't used this specific report, and I'm going to start adding it to our list of things we do in Discovery.
What about you, Jenna?
Yeah, though I think it's something I mentioned before with Jason. I get a little bit nervous about Google Analytics speed reporting in particular because it samples so very heavily. I'm sure you've covered it in your doc, but it's worth making sure that you tweak your GA settings so that it's measuring everybody. Otherwise, it's just 1% of your visitors. And then one person on a slow connection in a subway reading an article between stops skews all of your data when you're segmenting. So yeah, definitely use this, but make sure you've got a really robust GA setup. Otherwise, it's going to amplify all the bad stuff. But maybe that's not bad. If people are taking 80 seconds to load a page because they've got a bad connection, then you want to know that. You want to fix it.
Yeah, and the further you drill in on these components, the greater variation the sampling will introduce. So as you look at the country down to the network domain level, that sampling will get smaller and smaller relative to the overall population size. We internally use Google Analytics Premium. I'm not sure what they call it today, but we have no sampling in our data set. But in any Google Analytics report, sampling can play a role. But that's a very good call out, Jono, because you need to kind of take some of this information with a grain of salt, especially if you're on the free plan with Google Analytics. Another thing that people often overlook is that they'll use front-end testing tools like webpagetest.org or PageSpeed Insights, but what actually could be causing slow performance are processes happening on the back end. One of my favorite tools for unpacking that and discovering what might be causing those slowdowns is a tool called New Relic. And New Relic has a specific WordPress module or add-on that will help provide insights into how plugins and themes may be chewing up your performance. I grabbed this screenshot and blacked out the names of the ones with bad performance because there's a lot that can go into that. And one plugin or the other might have a bad score in a certain situation, a better score in another one. And I didn't want to shame any plugins here. But this view shows a list of plugins running on this site and the relative load those plugins are playing on the performance of that server, performance of that WordPress, if you would. Bill, I know you go really deep on this stuff. Is this an area where you monitor on some level with your clients?
Yeah, so some of our clients will use New Relic for ongoing performance monitoring. Most of the work we do is redesigning existing websites and like removing all the performance issues that are there. And so what for a simpler free version of this would be the P3 plugin. It's Performance Profiler plugin. And it does something similar where it'll go through a bunch of pages, find the relative performance impact of each plugin. And we'll use that when deciding which plugins to remove, what to replace, what to custom build. But yeah, we use tools like this, and we've used it a few times, but we usually use the freer tools for those initial audits because we'll be stripping away most of the performance issues, and we don't have to deal with them on the ongoing basis.
Wow, that's neat. I just learned something I'm going to have to go play with later. It was called the P3 Performance plugin?
P3 Profiler, I think, is the WordPress.org slug. I think it was built by GoDaddy or one of the hosts. And yeah, it just does a similar thing where you just click Generate Report and it loads like 5 or 10 pages and generates a screen very similar to this.
I love it. I love it. I'm definitely going to have to check that out. Thanks for sharing. So moving on, again, kind of in our kind of reporting and KPI zone here. Google gave this presentation, I grabbed this slide from a presentation they gave in Sydney at the WP Engine Summit. I was present and able to watch this. It was really interesting. The entire presentation was on setting a performance budget for your site. But the principle here is to put a stake in the sand, to say that I don't want any of my web pages to load slower than X. And you're going to need to figure out what X may mean for you. But the philosophy here is that as you build new experiences, as you build new pages, you make this part of your quality assurance and that you fit within your budget. Now, the thing about budgets, if you've ever had to keep one for yourself, you realize that there's trade-offs that you're going to have to do. So in the sake of visitors with slow 3G, you might be using less JavaScript, different approaches to fonts and images, But the point is that in order to hit performance target, you're going to have to make some real decisions around what you're including on your page and what you're not. I call this the balance of suffering and joy. So they're going to suffer a little bit from the speed and maybe get joy from the content. And so it's really, again, thinking about setting that stake in the ground and then sticking to it and making decisions that reflect that objective. Jonah, do you, in any of the projects you work on or exposed to, do you all set targets for page speed with new pages that you create?
Oh, I wish. I'm starting to see people think like this, though, because Google have pushed it so very heavily. I know there was an update relatively recently to Google's Lighthouse tool, which I'm sure we'll mention, which lets you set these kinds of performance budgets when you're auditing and measuring your site. It's transformative because if you suddenly start thinking about speed when you never really have, you also start thinking about SEO and accessibility and security, and it transforms organizations. I've seen one or two companies who've, in the process of stripping back pages that took 10 seconds to load that now take 2, say, we never want to get there again. We understood that we got there by accident over years of incremental iterative change, and now we want to be more mature. And suddenly, yeah, all those trade-offs happen, but they're really positive because the senior leadership have said no page will ever load slower than 3 seconds. And then people have to have hard conversations, but it forces them to build better things, and that's great.
Bill, I know your site loads lightning fast. I'm going to mention it later, a little story around that. But I'm curious, in your client work, obviously you're trying to make sites as performant as possible. Does the notion of a performance budget ever come up from your clients? Is it something you use in your work, or are you just always trying to trim as much as possible?
It does come up, and we'll do performance targeting sometimes. I find that during the initial development, we're so focused on performance that we get it as minimal as possible. And then over time, when I step back, and then the clients just sort of take it from there, and they might install a few plugins or upload some unoptimized images, and things just sort of grow. And I wish we had better tools that allowed them, like, on plugin activation, go and automatically test it and see if it affected the plugin, so that there's someone standing at that table focusing on performance if I'm not there, because I'm usually not part of those conversations. One more thing we tend to do is when we're adding a feature that we know is like computationally expensive or will add to the load time, is we'll use Google event tracking on that to see if people are actually interacting with it. So like button, like the social share count buttons or related posts, or seeing if there's maybe do an A/B testing on, do the actual counts on a post matter versus just having the buttons available. And based on that kind of data, we can decide how important these features are. Is it worth reaching out every few hours to Facebook and Twitter to get updated counts if no one's even interacting with those or looking at them, or if it affects the load time? So yeah, we like to use like data-driven metrics to sort of help quantify those features and say, this feature is this expensive and this many people are interacting with it. Do you want to keep it?
Yeah, that's a good point. So you'll add a new airfoil to your race car, but only if it makes it go faster. I think it was also really good of you to point out that performance is everyone's job. As you build this site, as you pass it on to others, or if you're the operator creating content, you're also introducing speed regressions or slowdowns into your site potentially, and that responsibility is shared by more than just your web developer. So as you go out and create those new content, those new experiences, separate from your development team who may be very focused on speed, keep in mind, of course, that you might be introducing slowness that might affect your ability to convert. All right, so I want to cover some of the infrastructure and network footprint topics, because obviously that can play a big role in your performance. The first is to choose a quality hosting platform focused on WordPress. Now, of course, I'm a bit of a shill for this because I work for one of these platforms, a company called WP Engine. We're a premium platform for WordPress, but I'm not necessarily going to go all into what makes us great, but rather to say really this quote, which actually did come from our CEO, where there's focus, there's progress. And my view on this, also in my agency days before I worked here, was that companies that focus on WordPress are able to optimize things like their infrastructure, their caching, their security rules, all the way down to their support staff. and through that focus are able to deliver often faster experiences than a platform that doesn't specialize in WordPress, where they're covering maybe many different types of sites, and therefore have a very large backlog of optimizations that may affect WordPress or Drupal or Joomla or other types of platforms that aren't specific to WordPress. Now, that being said, of course, there are platforms that don't specialize that still do a good job on performance. So the main observation I have here is choose a quality platform, and often when you choose one that's focused on WordPress, the performance benefits are there. Bill, I know you have customers that kind of move between hosts. Do you find that in some cases that the host does have a material impact on people's performance?
Yeah, the host usually has a very large impact. One of my favorite things is we use WP Engine as our development environment for all projects. And so when we're starting dev, we'll copy over the site to WP Engine, and then we'll build our new theme and plugins there. And then we'll discuss where they want to host it. And sometimes they'll say, well, we want to go back to our old host, or there's this other host, and then we'll launch it there, and then they'll start complaining. It's like, why is it so much slower? It was faster on development. It's like the only difference is the host. Like, you can A/B test it right now because it's already hosted over there. And so we've done a few times where we launched it on one host, and then a few weeks later launched it back on WP Engine.
Yep, and there's great points. There's a ton of platforms focused on WordPress. Automatic has some really good offerings. Pagely has a good offering, and there's other in the ecosystem. My main advice here is to find a platform that makes sense for you, and then load a copy of your site up there, and just like Bill pointed out, test to see which platform is going to be the best choice for you to deliver the best experience to your customers. If you're on cheaper hosting, and I get it, right? You have an idea, a little side blog, it's not very important, you don't want to spend a ton of money on the hosting aspect, and so you go with one of the cheaper hosts. It's fine, we've all been there. For that, I like to recommend this plugin called Edge Cache HTML, or I'm sorry, Cloudflare Page Cache, which uses Edge Cache HTML that was built by Cloudflare. Jason, do you recognize this person's photo on the left here?
No, I don't.
That is Pat Meenan, the creator of webpagetest.org. Yep, and we saw his
It's a very small market, isn't it? It's a very small world, the page speed.
I know. Well, Pat has had a few roles since he first created Web Page Test back in 1996, I think. He was working for AOL, but he now works for Cloudflare, and one of his first projects was to create this page cache plugin. It's a really good complement for folks running on cheaper hosting. It'll definitely help you get a little bit of, especially for certain types of sites, a pretty decent boost on your page speed. So if budget's low and you don't have money for one of the more expensive or focused platforms in terms of WordPress, and you're running on cheaper hosting, definitely check out Edge Cache HTML. Bill or Jono, have either of you heard of this plugin before?
Yep, I run it on my site over on johnalderson.com. I'm on really good hosting, but I still run it because it's like Cloudflare is one of the best products in the world. And being able to serve static copies of my web pages from literally in the same city as people who are requesting it, even with the best hosting in the world, you still can't always quite get to that level of proximity. So it's a no-brainer for me to add on, and it makes such a huge difference. It's so powerful. It's such, so the combination of Cloudflare's Edge capability and this plugin is just astoundingly good.
Awesome. What about you, Bill?
I haven't used this specific plugin. I'm definitely going to check it out, but we do integrate Cloudflare on almost all our projects, whether it's through WP Rocket or connecting like on the host level. Cloudflare, it just makes sense. It's like, why not take that free performance boost?
Absolutely. So that does.
Yeah, I've been using it, but my biggest experience, I used to run a site for kids. We had games and songs, and it was all in Flash. The file's quite heavy. And in the end, we were using about 2005 a CDN, and it makes all the difference in the world because kids are infamously very impatient, and parents get very impatient. And when we switched to a CDN, the whole thing changed. We went from we had a 25% boost in about 6 months simply from the fact that we were much closer to the users to deliver that content.
Maybe I need a CDN at dinner time to help with my kids' impatience, Jason.
Serve them their meals closest to them. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, exactly, right? That would come in handy. Well, that's a good point. And it kind of brings up this next slide. So the Edge Cache HTML plugin enables the use of the CDN in some very specific ways. But independent of that, and many of hosts and platforms will bundle a CDN as part of their service. But if they don't, you can also purchase your own CDN, access to a CDN. The two providers I like are Cloudflare and Max CDN. And as Jason alluded to, basically there are hundreds of servers all over the world that will basically store a piece of your website. They could either store the entire page. This is called full page caching. They might just store the images or the videos. Cloudflare also has a video CDN I'll talk about here a little bit later. But the reason this is important is because, again, geographically, it's helpful to be closer to your visitors. So if that server's down the street for them, then that's less what are called hops. Basically, your connection bounces between routers. And the more hops you have, the more latency you can introduce, and also the more distance can add to latency. And all of those things can slow down the visitor's experience. So by leveraging a CDN that distributes your site or pieces of it, you can actually dramatically improve the experience for that end user. Now, the speed of light is actually super fast. That's usually not the restriction. It's usually the exchanges between data between the routers and all these hops that will add to that latency. I think you all just commented that you love a CDN, but anything else to add here?
Nope, I don't think so.
Awesome. Definitely check that out. So now for the next section, I want to talk a little bit beyond the infrastructure. We talked about having a good host, leveraging a CDN, but want to talk about some things you can do to your site itself. Bill, you mentioned this. I think a topic on WordPress speed optimization or a presentation on WordPress speed optimization can't go by without someone mentioning WP Rocket. It's a great way to cover a lot of the bases as it relates to page speed optimization. There is minification for your JavaScript and your CSS. There's caching built into it. So if your host doesn't use a cache, WP Rocket is a great way to achieve that. They also have what are called filters in there that will detect if it's running on a host with caching and turn the caching off. There's image compression capabilities within WP Rocket. Basically, any blog posts you've read, top 10 ways to speed up WordPress, 8 or 9 of them are going to be checked off with WP Rocket. Bill, what are your thoughts on some of the primary strengths around Rocket?
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, 8 of the 10 things that'll improve your performance, like all the low-hanging fruit is taken care of by that plugin. And what I really like is that they are, I'm not sure if it's they're doing it or the host doing it, but they disable the things that are duplicated by the hosts. And so I can safely deploy that plugin on any host and not worry about it conflicting with that host's particular cache. And I really like all the nice features that you can turn on and off, like lazy loading and minifying things and not concatenating them, and like there's just a lot of tools in there that you can use to get a lot of easy wins.
Jono, what about you? You can't be a stranger to Rocket.
No, it's one of my favorites. It's a go-to. I think it does a few things fantastically well. One is it's super simple to use. Even if you're a basic user and you don't necessarily understand the detail and the terminology, their documentation is great. Their information is really helpful. You can turn things on, you can test it, you can turn things off. It solves all of the basic problems out the box, and it integrates beautifully into Cloudflare, and the two shake hands, and everything synchronizes all the cache data and stuff purges. It's really, really nice. Yeah, I can't imagine many use cases where you wouldn't want to be running this.
Yeah, the team over there and founders are super nice people. My experience with them and folks I know that have used them and contacted their support has all been very positive. Bill, I can confirm they do work with hosts around exclusion of the caching things and things like that to make sure that there's not conflicts and overlap. But definitely a good product to check out. Again, covering a lot of those common bases.
We had a quick question from Jim Floyd, who's asking, should we be using WP Rocket with Cloudflare? Is that a good idea to put the two together?
Yes, absolutely. Sure. Yes, absolutely. They do fundamentally different things. However, WP Rocket enables you to set certain CDN configurations with Cloudflare. So using them in concert is absolutely something you can do. I've also seen performance tests of WP Rocket running on premium platforms like WP Engine, where even with the benefits of those platforms, a lot of the on-site or on-page optimizations will give you additional benefits above and beyond those premium levels of hosting. This is an interesting thing I don't think people realize or consider when they think about improving performance, but it's this concept of offloading. An example of offloading is when you embed a YouTube video. The video is stored on YouTube. The processing power to play and to stream the video is on YouTube's server, and that means that that storage and the compute time needed to deliver that for the end user is greatly reduced or just frankly removed from your website. This plugin, you can see a little URL at the bottom, is the Cloudflare Stream plugin. This actually leverages the Cloudflare Video CDN, and basically what it allows you to do is to embed videos directly inside of WordPress, which are stored and streamed from the Video CDN. Now, this is just one example of offloading. There's many, 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 many other examples of leveraging external services in order to relieve your web server and your WordPress from doing all of that work. Now, of course, this is a double-edged sword, because if you choose the wrong place to offload that work to, they might deliver a slow experience that might actually cause you problems. Bill, you're using offloading, I'm guessing, in some of the sites that you're building.
Yeah, we've used it on a few sites. We haven't used that specific plugin. Most of our videos we host on YouTube, both for the offloading, but also for video search, because YouTube's the second largest search engine. We will use, I forget what it's called, like WP Offload S3 or something by Delicious Brain.
Yeah, WP Offload Media.
Yeah, to S3. So that's the one we typically use to offload, especially with food bloggers, where they'll have like 50 gigabytes of images on the server. And so sending that over to S3 and letting the server focus on the actual website works well.
Jono, any additional thoughts on your side?
I also use WP Offload Media. It's really good. I host all my images or the various client images in Amazon, which obviously has its own CDN. It's dirt cheap. But then I also make sure that those images are getting cached by Cloudflare. So they are hosted not in my infrastructure, which means my server can be better configured. And then they're cached by Cloudflare, so I barely pay anything for the Amazon stuff. It just means that my WordPress site is doing barely any heavy lifting, which is great.
Exactly. And so when you offload, when you push this work external, it's not just the page where the video or the asset might be loading that gets faster. It's all of your other pages too, because that is essentially one entity working to serve all of these pages. And so if the server is having to work real hard on a video page, that means it's also delivering a slower performance on your homepage or on your blog. So offloading is a key strategy in my view. Another way you can increase your performance is to scale your performance. Of course, WordPress comes with themes, and now it comes with what are called blocks as part of the new Gutenberg editor. Atomic Blocks and StudioPress are two of the products in my universe, but specifically the recommendation here is optimize your theme, optimize the blocks and pages you create such that when you reuse them, you can inherit those performance optimizations from the past. So not every single page, not every single line of code has to be optimized every time. You can reuse assets to inherit those performance benefits from the past. Bill, I know you do modularized approaches, componentized approaches in some way. Do you think of this context of inheriting performance benefits when you're doing that?
Yeah, I mean, so all the sites we build are fairly custom, and so we'll support obviously all the core WordPress blocks, but most of our custom blocks we build ourselves so that they are performance focused. If I were to use, if I were looking for a block library to use, I'd go for Atomic Blocks because it is performance focused. There's a lot of block library plugins out there, and one of the performance is usually not their competitive advantage. They're marketing like all their features and all the options, and like page builders in the past, these can bloat your site. Like, yeah, you have like a million options and you can make them look really pretty, but all of those scripts and styles they load can slow things down. And I like how Atomic Blocks puts a focus on performance, and it focuses on integrating with other performance focused tools like AMP.
Yep. The balance of suffering and joy. What about you, Jono? I'm sure you think about componentized performance, or just
Nothing really to add, just to echo exactly that balance of performance and pain. All of the site builders and page builders and drag and drop things come at the cost of reinventing the wheel in every case, and every single thing you edit is a new thing that adds weight. Whereas the more streamlined and component driven you can be, the less overhead there is overall. I mean, that comes with its own dev costs and planning and future proofing, but ultimately that's a much better approach if you can do it.
Yep, and then certainly with things like full page caching, even some of those bloated page builders can still result in pages that delight people.
One quick note in here. One of the things I really like about the Gutenberg block experience is that it makes WordPress more intelligent about the content in the page, rather than it just being one big text area and you don't know what's in there. Everything is a structured block, and those blocks can load their own styles and scripts. So if you have one block used on one page that loads JavaScript, you don't have to load that site wide. That block itself can just load it when it's needed.
Oh, I love that. Sounds like we do a whole webinar on just that one topic.
Oh, yeah.
But the point here is spend time on your theme. Spend time, if you're using the block editor, on your blocks to optimize for performance so you can inherit those benefits in the future. And then the final slide here in the presentation before we kick off into more of the panel discussions is around AMP. And I know this is a controversial topic for people, and they have different views on Google's intent with AMP and what does this mean for the broader web and all these kind of things. But the way that I think about AMP in general is that in some very unique and specific ways, they can help you achieve a faster page load time. Now, you don't need AMP to make your site faster. There's a lot of the things that you can do yourself without AMP to make it faster. But some of the unique benefits include, in some sense, CSS tree shaking, but even a little bit more than that, I think more impactful than that, is pre-fetching the content of your site. When you run on Google's AMP cache and you're on the Google search results, the page loads automatically in the background for the visitor coming from the Google search engine. You can't get that through any other method of optimizing your site for performance. If you Google Bill Erickson AMP, Bill has a great article about setting up a WordPress site to work with AMP, and what you'll find is that that page loads lightning, I mean just instantly insane fast when searching and finding it from the Google search engine. Certain search views only show content that leverages AMP. So in terms of search visibility, for certain kinds of sites, particularly publishers, recipe sites, and other forms of sites, you actually may be excluded from certain types of views within SERPs if you don't use AMP. The downside to AMP generally, certainly you're going to have to learn it and then learn how to build with it in the future. But the primary trade-off is options. You're going to have a lot less ability to use things like JavaScript. AMP is a standard in a sense, meaning that it's a subset of HTML. And in some people's views, they've chopped off all the fun parts. And so there might be elements of your site. I know, right? It just depends on who you are, whether you consider these things important. But AMP is restrictive in some of the technology and some of the approaches you can use, which could put restrictions on what plugins you might be able to choose or what elements you might be able to add to your website. And so this is, again, the trade-off. There's unique speed benefits. There's unique search visibility benefits. But then the trade-off is you might have to relent on some options or experiences on your site. The best plugin for this, in my view, is the official AMP plugin by Google, which you can see linked here at the bottom. Bill, I'm a little nervous even talking about AMP with you on the phone, considering how deep you go on all this. What did I miss? What did I get wrong?
I don't know. You covered all the bases. Like, just to rehash what you said, there's three main benefits to AMP. Actual performance improvements due to the requirements of AMP. Perceived performance improvements because they'll preload your results. So even if your site takes 3 seconds to load, it'll be instant to users in Google search. And then placement in AMP-only SERP locations like featured stories and things. The requirements of AMP just force you to build a performant website. Like you have to keep styles down to 50 kilobytes or less. You can't load any external JavaScript other than AMP components. And actually, when I build an AMP site, like my website I was built as a native AMP website. So I built everything in there specifically for AMP. And then recently I did some performance testing. The non-AMP version of my website loads faster. So just the fact of building a super performant website that meets the requirements of AMP, you don't need AMP to have a performant website. And so that real performance boost will work regardless of AMP. But without AMP, you don't get that perceived performance boost. And so on a lot of the publisher sites we will do what's called transitional AMP, which means people who are just typing in the direct URL of your post will get a non-AMP version, but it's using the exact same style sheet and markup and everything as your site. And then people coming from mobile SERPs will get the AMP version. And they'll look the same. The people who would benefit from AMP get that benefit. And then that opens up your options a little more because if you have certain features that aren't AMP compatible, you can do them on your normal URL, not on the AMP version. And so that you sort of get the best of both worlds in that regard.
What about you, Juno? What are your thoughts on AMP?
I'm pro team AMP. When it was released, I was in the school of thought with a lot of other SEO people that it was a bit contentious and that it felt a little bit like Google trying to reinvent the web for their own nefarious purposes. I've played a lot with it. I've talked to a lot of people and seen it evolve, and I'm now convinced that A, AMP is a very good thing, and B, I think there's a reasonable chance it might become the future of how we build websites on the web. For all the same reasons we've talked about through all this, that it's hard to build a performant website to maintain it. It's hard to get the trade-offs of how many ads do I show versus how slow does that make my site right. It's hard to maintain that. And I think we see on the whole that the web is slow. The mobile web isn't great, and the current tools we have, or the current processes or business processes we have, don't make it easy to build performant websites. So constraints aren't inherently a bad thing. I think all of the many of the things that you can't do with AMP, like show lots of invasive pop-ups or have things trigger without users interacting with them, aren't good for users, or at least aren't necessarily good for users. And the things they're banning are the bad behaviors. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. That means business models will hurt. People will need to change their approach to how they design and build things. But I think that's good for the web. I think if you're building a new site tomorrow, I would gamble on building it AMP first. And because sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say one more thing to add is the more advanced and functional custom features you need on your website, AMP might make your job a lot easier.
Oh God, yeah, it's all modules.
Yeah. There's hundreds of AMP components, and so on a site I was building last week, we have these carousels of posts on the homepage. Normally we'd have to use a WordPress plugin or load a JavaScript library and write a bunch of JavaScript and HTML and stuff. With AMP, you just use the AMP carousel HTML element, and then you just list the 3 things inside of it, and AMP takes care of everything for you. I spend more work rebuilding that functionality for the non-AMP version. That's 90% of the time. The 10% is just using the AMP version. And so you said, AMP is a subset of HTML, but it's also a superset of HTML. It includes a bunch of elements that you wish were in HTML, like a carousel element or an AMP sidebar element that slides in, that you don't have to build custom now.
And I think the most incredible thing that nobody's really talking about is that it gets better over time. The AMP is all open source, there's thousands of people contributing it, adding code to improving it. As those improvements roll out, if you're running the AMP code, you get them automatically. So those teams of developers you had and those years of backlogs of issues and things you want to improve, now your website is improving itself automatically. And that profoundly changes the way that businesses run and operate their sites.
Yeah, I remember when AMP came out, and also being a bit of an AMP hater back in the day. A lot of apprehension around the motivation behind AMP.
Yes.
Google's clearly stated they view that AMP is helping to support a faster and open web, which they have a vested interest in. They have made gains, I feel, on a lot of the elements that were causing people heartburn. One has been to take a more open governance approach, which I think is helping to deflate the concerns around this being some sort of, secret mission or something by them.
Yeah.
The other one which I think for me, having a background in SEO that made me most uncomfortable, was that when your pages were loaded from the Google search results, the visitors had a Google domain instead of your own domain for those AMP cached pages. And for anyone that cares about their domains and control over their URL strings, that's extremely uncomfortable. There was a change 2 years ago in the basically the way domains are handled and recognized that allowed them to essentially have your domain show up for those Google AMP pages. So this notion that you're going to have a Google URL for your AMP pages no longer has to be true. So I think from my view, Google's been listening and reacting to this kind of feedback, but still a balance between gaining those benefits and trading off a little bit.
Yep.
Bill, I liked your context of or your explanation of transitional AMP. I think it's really interesting for people to think about as they think about what things they might be giving up in order to pursue AMP.
Great.
Yeah.
We've actually only got 5 minutes left, so we're going to have to wrap this up now. Get the slides off so we can see the nice big pictures of everybody. Have a couple of quick questions. That was absolutely brilliant. I've been sitting here just watching, listening, trying to learn. What I did like about that last point, and coming from a world of having built Flash websites right at the beginning of the web, is I think constraints are a good thing. It forces you to look to the essential. It would force you also to go and look at what your clients actually want, which is what Elmer Boutin was saying to me yesterday, using data to understand what they want, not what you think they want. And using AMP says, okay, you're very restricted, but maybe you can be a bit more creative with what you're doing.
Yeah.
So last questions. We had, I can see Jock who's asking about images, JPEG versus PNG versus whatever the new format that Google have brought out. Joe now.
It depends. Typical answer for an SEO, but it really does. Google PageSpeed Insights documentation has some really good guidelines on optimizing images, but the short version is pick the right format. There are some cases where a JPEG is better than a PNG. There are some cases where the other is true. In many cases, it might be that a WebP is your best bet, which is a newish format. And if you're running Cloudflare, you'll find that it will automatically convert most of your images to WebP, but only when it makes sense to do so. But yeah, go read all of Google's documentation and understand the criteria. There's all sorts of moving parts.
Yeah, there's a lot of aspects when it comes to image optimization. Number one, make sure you're loading the right sized image. If your content area is 600 pixels wide and you're inserting a 3,000 pixel image, there's no amount of optimization that's going to fix that. Step two is make sure the images you upload are optimized. And the best way to do that is automatically with a plugin, whether it's like the Tiny PNG plugin or Imagify, or there's a bunch of other ones where when you upload it, they'll automatically compress it. And you'll see 60 to 70% improvement on there. And then a lot of those plugins will also automatically generate the WebP image for you when so if your device supports it, it'll load that faster one. And then finally, leverage the WordPress source set so that on different devices you're loading different images. And so we will create like the image size that we want shown in a certain area, and then we'll create a 2x version that we're not loading, but WordPress will stick it in there and the source set. And so if they're on a high resolution screen and the browser thinks that's the right image, add that in there. And then finally, use lazy loading. So Chrome is adding support for like native lazy loading. WP Rocket has built-in support for a JavaScript-based lazy loading. AMP has lazy loading built in, so you don't have to do anything. So only load the images that need to be seen right now.
There is, in fact, a Google plugin.
Okay, and somebody else is asking about different.
We're out of sync, Jason. Sorry. I'll be quiet.
Sorry, excuse me. Carry on.
No, it's all good.
Well, I'm trying to kind of get through as many of these as I can because somebody else was saying that they missed. What are the great platforms? Can we have three? I know we can start with David. The hosting platforms for WordPress, which is going to be the fastest? David starts, then Bill, then Jonah.
I had referenced WP Engine and Automatic.
I would say WP Engine, Big Scoots, and SiteGround for the lower cost option.
I would have said all of those. So having already been said, I would say ServeBolt and DigitalOcean.
Brilliant stuff. I had another question. We were talking earlier on about measuring the site speed of our actual users, and you were talking about analytics. I've been pushing my clients to use Pingdom tools, the Pingdom system. Anybody got any thoughts on that? Because I thought it was brilliant, but am I misreading it?
I think Pingdom's fine. A lot of these tools, the real magic is in how they show you the information and how you interpret it. But I think Pingdom is fine. But I don't personally use it. Jono, Bill?
I hop between a few. I know that Cloudflare just added those run those real user metrics insights to their performance stuff. So I'm going to start looking at that quite deeply.
Yeah, I mean, I have used it in the past, and I think it's comparable to web page tests. One of the things I like about like the Google's Insight one is for all the issues, it'll link you directly to deep documentation on how to fix that. So in addition to identifying the issue, it'll help you find a solution.
Oh, and all the Google Lighthouse stuff.
Okay, that's you're
on. Oh, we are out of sync. I'm sorry.
No, it's not you. It's me. I'm the one who's sorry. I'm in Las Vegas, miles away from anywhere, in the middle of the desert, and there's terrible lag. So I'm the one who apologizes to absolutely everyone. I should. Good point. I think that from what comes out of this from me is that actually the solutions to make WordPress faster are relatively simple, with WP Rocket, Cloudflare, decent hosting at the back, on the backside, as it were, and that looking at it from your user's point of view and not thinking you know what they need or what they're experiencing or what they want, and starting with something simple and then building it out. As Bill was saying, if you build your AMP site first, you're forced to do something simple, forced to do something effective, and then your desktop, or your mobile version or your desktop version for non-AMP users in mobile is going to be phenomenally better, and bullying yourself, forcing yourself to build from, as it were, the bottom up, starting with the most restrictive and performant format is a great way to start, even though it's very painful for most of us. Thank you very much. That was my little conclusion of what we've just said. David, great presentation, amazing stuff, really, really impressive. Bill, amazing answers to the questions. And Jonah, I've met you so many times, and I know you're always good for a laugh and a lot of useful information. So thank you very much. We'll say goodbye. We've had the hour, and I'm completely out of sync. Won't be like this next time. Thanks a lot, guys. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks.